Hello, everybody. I'm Simone from Play with Food.
And I'm Kristy Goodwin from drkristygoodwin.com.
So we are here today to talk a little bit about screen time implications and meal times. So not necessarily just screens at the meal, but screens in general, how it's impacting our children's development in such a digital world these days, and also what that's turning around and doing to our meal times. So I'm really glad you're all here. We will get going. So I'll talk a little bit about myself first. I am an SOS feeding specialist from Sydney. I have a website, www.playwithfood.com.au. I work part-time in feeding therapy, mostly looking at food anxiety, sensory issues relating to food, some oral motor functioning when it comes to food, and transitioning kids into a wider dietary repertoire. So mostly dealing with problem feeders there in that part-time role. But what Play with Food aims to do is also help parents with fussy eaters, which may not be as extreme, but still definitely can benefit from a lot of the same knowledge and information to use in their daily lives.
Fantastic. I'm Dr. Kristy Goodwin. I'm a children's technology, learning and development researcher and a mum with two of my own digital natives as well. And I take the science and the research about how technology is impacting on young children's health, well-being, learning and development, and translate it into practical and digestible information for mums and dads who are trying to navigate the digital terrain. Without telling parents that they need to unplug the TV or ban the iPad. I want to put an end to parents' techno guilt and help take the guesswork and the guilt out of raising kids in the digital age by giving parents facts, not fears. I think there's a lot of scaremongering. And my aim today is not to make you feel guilty about using screens if that's what you elect to do with your children, but informing you to make powerful decisions about how you can best use them.
Yeah.
So not digitally amputating our kids.
And that's definitely the core aim of what I like to do as well, arming parents with some tools and ideas to get some happiness back at the meal table and, talk about the fact that, it doesn't have to be a nightmare. It doesn't have to be a battle. So we'll definitely go through that today. And that it's not about being made guilty. It's just to give you some more tools in the toolbox is what I always say.
Absolutely.
Can't hurt to learn more.
No, definitely not.
And I have to say I have learned so much from Dr. Kristy's book and from now being with her personally. We've met a couple of times, which has been great. And what I thought we'd talk about first is getting Dr. Kristy to tell us a little bit more about the basic needs. What do we need our child to know and understand from a developmental point of view?
I'm going to just quickly talk about brain science in about 1 minute, so not to bore you, but I think for parents, we need to know how our children's brain is developing and why it's so important that we have an appreciation of this. And then I'll explain what children's 7 basic needs are. So children's brains undergo a rapid period of development. In fact, the research is telling us that between the ages of 0 and 3, almost 85% of brain development, the neural pathways are formed. So it's a really critical time when children's neural connections, their brain pathways, are being established. So the types of experiences we provide for our children really are laying the foundation for their neurological development. It is a period of rapid growth. We know, for example, children are making 700 synapses, which are basically connections every single second, which is just mind-blowing. So as parents, not only are we the counsellor and the chef, we're also brain architects. So the types of experiences we provide for our kids really do lay the foundation, not only for their emotional development, but also for their social and their cognitive development too. We also know that brain development, 70% of it comes down to nurture, and only 30% can we blame on our partner and their genetic gene pool. So experiences that we provide are critical in shaping their brain architecture. And I think that's really powerful. We know that if we're introducing screens, as we often do these days at earlier and earlier ages, it can impact children's brain architecture. We know, for example, the first 3 years of life are critical for the sensory and the motor parts of the brain to be developed. So in those 3 years of life, the brain is predominantly focused on getting those neural pathways laid down.
Yeah. And they're super important ones for eating.
Absolutely. And so that sensory and the motor region, if kids aren't getting enough experience or exposure to touch things, this is why kids put everything in their mouths, why they want to touch everything, why they constantly look like they've got ants in their pants, they're always moving. Kids actually learn off energy, not burn off energy. So it's really important that we make sure that our kids are getting enough time to develop those sensory pathways and also the motor pathways there. From about the age of 3 or 4, brain development shifts from these primitive parts of the brain more to this prefrontal cortex. And this is basically our brain's CEO or the air traffic control system. So lots is going on in those first 3 years of life. And this can sometimes explain, and I think we'll unpack this today, why we sometimes have difficulties getting our kids to eat, especially in this digital age where they are bombarded with what I call sensory seductions. There's always something these days vying for our attention. There's sound effects, and there's flashing, and there's beeping. And for children whose nervous system is still developing and their sensory system is still developing, this can sometimes be overload for them.
Like puts them into that flight or fright mode.
Absolutely.
So quickly compared to what we are, and we can tune those things out, but we've got our filters.
Absolutely. And the reason we can and our kids often can't, and they're not expected to, please don't think we have unrealistic expectations, but we have a developed prefrontal cortex, so we can manage our impulses, we can direct our attention. Our kids are growing up in a world where they are constantly being bombarded with sensory information to process, and they don't have the impulse control center. This is one of the last parts of the brain to actually fully become developed, and they're also being, bombarded with sensory input that they have to process. So this, and we'll explain in more detail, might be one of the reasons why our kids have a battle with us at mealtimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes.
So many parents will use screen time to enable them to get dinner ready, get a couple of last minute jobs done just before mealtime. So we plonk the kids down in the TV, iPad, tablet, something like that. And we kind of run about, get busy, get our things done, or we might even take a quick sneaky break to look at our phones. Can you tell us a little bit about why some kids then have like a techno tantrum when we turn the TV off?
Yes, and can I assure you that techno tantrums are normal, and they're not, unfortunately, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, they're not restricted just to toddlers and 3-year-olds. Okay. I've seen some adults having techno tantrums and older children as well. But what we actually know is that our children's brains are undergoing neurobiological changes, so that when they're using a screen, there are 4 main reasons to explain why they have the techno tantrum. First and foremost is that when children are using a screen, it's usually a pleasurable thing. They're watching something funny. They don't have to invest a whole lot of cognitive effort. It's instant, it's rewarding, very little effort is required. And so this releases the neurotransmitter dopamine, and this makes children want more and more of it. So when you say turn the TV off and come and have dinner, you are literally cutting off their supply of dopamine. And this is why and this is exactly why as adults, we find it hard to turn off our phones at night, why we're constantly doing one more scroll of social media.
And it has no stop. We could just keep going.
Absolutely. And that's the second reason that I wanted to touch on, is that in the online world, we have something called the state of insufficiency. There's no full stop. There's no finite finishing point. And this is why it's sometimes hard to drag kids away from the iPad or the video game and to get them to come to the dinner table, because they don't actually feel completed. Unlike, completing a jigsaw puzzle or reading a book where you close the last page, there is a clear line of demarcation between start and finish. Yeah. In the online world, there's no full stop. It literally is constant. So that's another reason why we get the techno tantrum. The third reason is that our kids and us as well as adults often enter something called the psychological state of flow. And this is where we become so engrossed with what we're doing online that we lose all track of time. So this is why often saying to your child, you've got 5 minutes until dinner's ready, is absolutely meaningless for our kids, because they lose track. And again, they have to actually understand conceptually what 5 minutes means. For a lot of our young kids, that's meaningless to begin with. But for kids that do understand the concept of time, if they have entered that psychological state of flow, they lose themselves in the online world as well.
Yeah,
and I think the fourth reason that kids have techno tantrums is that the brain, this prefrontal cortex here, this is that CEO that I was referring to earlier, is primed for novelty. So we are always looking for new and interesting things. You know, if we go back to our caveman days, this was the part of the brain that kept us safe. So this is the part of the brain that's always scanning for new, interesting bits of information that pique our interest. This is why the online world appeals to our kids. There's that constant sense of novelty. So to say to, again, we're almost, when we digitally amputate them and pull them away from that, their brain's not getting the novelty that it's wired to crave.
So this would be like when the kids are halfway through something on the screen and they're already like, and next we can do this. Already wanting that next thing.
That's right. And the online world caters for that. You know, YouTube is a prime example of, you know, there's so many little snippets down the side.
Next song.
Exactly.
And I get to hear 5 seconds of each one because they keep moving to the next one.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it's normal. Techno tantrums are normal.
Okay. Yep.
And I think if we can understand what, you know, that our kids' brains are having a neurobiological response, I think it helps us to at least appreciate. And no, there's not an app to prevent techno tantrums, but I think just understanding you're not the only one that's encountering these.
Yeah, absolutely. Around the country every night at 5:30, we're getting a whole lot of techno tantrums. So what do you think we should do? Like a little summary about what we could do about stopping techno tantrums, or at least making them not as drastic.
Absolutely. So I think first and foremost is that we need to establish boundaries around our kids' screen time before they turn the device on. So it's often too late to start negotiating on either how many episodes they're going to watch or what level in the game they're going to get to once they've started it. So establish your boundaries before you turn the device on. Try before mealtime in particular to choose technology that does have a finite full stop. So, you know, telling them you're going to watch one episode of Play School and then we're going to turn it off. Or you're going to get to this level in the app, or you'll read the storybook on the iPad. So something that has a clear finishing point.
Yep.
I think giving kids reminders, even if they don't understand the concept of time, but just gentle reminders, because remember, they've entered that psychological state of flow. So you need to bring them back. Verbal reminders often don't work very well with kids, literally, because they'll often give you the dismissive, sure, mum, or okay, that generic response. We need to interrupt their state of flow and actually get them to make eye contact. Outsource some of your parenting where you can. Use a timer. Kids will not, you know, offer to wash the dishes, scrub the floors and make the beds for 6 weeks when their time has elapsed on the timer on the microwave or an egg timer or the timer on the tablet device. They seem to understand those parameters a lot more. That's right. Another really powerful, and it sounds very simple, but it has a really powerful effect with our kids, is actually empowering them to switch the device off. It can become a real power struggle when you are literally trying to yank the remote control or the device off the child. So getting them to turn the device off is really empowering. And this one I think is important, to actually enforce consequences if they don't adhere to the rules. Kids need to know, you know, that technology is a tool, it's not a toy, and that it is a privilege to use it and not a right. I think a lot of our kids are growing up in this digital world where it's almost like an expectation that they can have access to it. So unfortunately, there's no silver bullet that will prevent the techno tantrum, but I think some firm boundaries and sticking to those can work really well.
Fantastic. So definitely enforcing consequences, something that I talk about a lot, and making sure you don't dig yourself in a hole and have a consequence you don't want to follow through with, like going to the park, which is mummy's little outlet too. We don't say if you don't do this, you don't get to go to the park, because that would take away my fun thing as well. So I think that's a really good one. And I also do talk a lot when it comes to feeding about giving children control.
Yes.
So we'll touch on that a lot too today, because they can control a lot. And so giving them the right to have that control does help you as well, because they know what to do, what to expect.
Yeah. And it works really well with young children. That sense of control they learn from a very, you know, young age, that they have that locus of control, and that's an empowering thing for young children.
So there's some people who may not even switch the TV off for dinners, and that we're calling them in notes that you've got available to print out today, screen dinners.
Yep.
Can you tell me a bit more about screen dinners?
Yeah, look, they are becoming more prevalent, and I'm the first to admit we do have a screen dinner occasionally. So I'm not saying, you know, we should avoid them, ban them altogether, and that they're toxic and taboo. But I think we need to be mindful about always having the meal around a screen. We know from the research it is becoming more prevalent in family homes. We know, for example, in 2015 that 24% of 2-year-olds were eating dinner with a screen, and by the age of 8 it had doubled to nearly 45%. So we're seeing a lot more of it.
Yep.
And I think we just need to be conscious about always allowing our kids to use the screen around mealtime.
Yep.
We know there are huge social and academic benefits from having a shared meal without devices being present. So I think we just need to be mindful. So my question is often, when I suggest this in parent seminars that I deliver, then why is it so easy for my child to eat in front of a screen? Because I think if we're really honest, it is often easier. And a lot of parents report that their children will eat more, will be more willing to try new foods in front of a screen. Can you explain why that might be the case?
There's a whole lot of information about what actually happens when we're in that screen zone. The first thing is we opt to eat easier foods while we're in front of a screen. So the muscles and motor coordination to eat a whole, say, steak, for example, requires a really big, you need probably cutlery to cut it first, then a bite, a big pull, which actually requires core strength, and then being able to lateralize your tongue to move the food under your big molars, and then a good rotary chew, which actually doesn't really well form in a lot of kids past like 2 or 3 years of age. So those sort of skills we're not going to be using in front of a screen if we are opting for easier foods. So we'll tend to opt for like your chicken nuggets or your meatballs, or even just like a bowl of pasta and sauce that you don't even really chew, you just slurp it all in. Stir fries the same. So those foods are actually easier. We can turn off some of those sensory inputs that are usually a bit too hard with some foods. So talking about that spaghetti bolognese, for example, if the kids are sitting down and looking at an overwhelming bowl full of spaghetti bolognese where they've got bits of the bright white pasta followed by the the red sauce, and they can see bits in there, they're not really sure what it is. That's a lot of visual input, let alone all the other inputs we've got to take in. So what we'll do is, if you're just getting that either spoon-fed to you, or you can sit there and not really look at that food, you're actually turning off a lot of that sensory or learning about that food. So you're eating quite mindlessly. And then we basically need less motor planning for some of those selected foods. So it's very hard to eat, and you don't see too many kids with a fork having their spaghetti bolognese. So what you might find is they'll use their hands. Less motor coordination than the cutlery, which, I'm all about embracing mess and stuff, but it's remembering to keep up the skills at the level where we're kind of wanting them to be at. So when we're having, 8-year-olds still eating pasta with their fingers, we might be looking at a bit of a issue there. But lots of less motor planning with the way we eat. We'll tend to have, like, chicken nuggets don't need a lot of motor planning. It's just bite in, barely have to pull because they fall apart in your mouth. And then the thing about spoon feeding in front of a TV is you basically got zero learning about that food. The child is not learning to look at the food. That they probably might get a bit of a smell, but like you said, if they're in that state of flow, they're probably not even really turned on that olfactory sense to really even smell it. So when we're thinking, oh, this is so much less stress, and my kids eat anything in front of the TV, in fact, but the problem is we haven't learned anything about that food. So if they turn around and they're in a different environment, or the TV's not available, they don't know how to eat because they haven't learned how to eat.
Yes.
Even though they've been eating.
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit earlier before we jumped on this recording about how kids often do tend to eat more in front of screens, and it often, for a lot of parents, it seems like the digital solution. You know, I've battled meal times, and all of a sudden I put the iPad at the table and my child is eating. But what we know is that there's a novelty effect often associated with that, so it often doesn't result in long-term habits. And as you said before,
it's something that could be a lifesaver technique that we're using at the moment, but the problem, or what I see sort of clinic anecdotally wise as well, is they will then just stop. They won't eat with the TV on. They'll be so engrossed in it, or the iPad or whatever, they won't eat then. And you're now left with a compounded issue of they don't know what food they've been eating because they haven't been learning about it because they've been in front of the TV or the iPad, and now they don't eat with it on either. How are you going to get out of that scenario? And a lot of the time the option is to go back to your really not great health choice wise foods, very processed, or we start omitting the harder foods and food groups to eat, and meat and vegetables are the hard ones. And hate to break it to you, but they are the hard ones, and I'm sure most parents in the audience will be like, I know, vegetables and meat are hard. They require so much more sensory processing and input and understanding to be able to eat. Even the same every time you buy it. I get a zucchini one week, it'll be a little bit sweet, and the next week it's got this like tang to it or something. Like, it's not even the same each time you prepare it, and then it's often in dishes where each bite isn't even the same because you have it in a casserole or a bolognese, and you'll have like a chunk of zucchini one time, and then the next bite will have a chunk of potato or something. So we don't set ourselves up very well for success in eating our vegetables and meat. They are the hard food groups, but exposure is always better, and learning is such an important part of getting those food groups in and keeping them in the diet for the long term, because we know to have a healthy, balanced diet, we definitely need vegetables. And if you ever talk to anyone who doesn't endorse vegetables, don't listen to them.
And I think the key thing you said there for me, and tying the neuroscience back in, is that if their senses are not being dedicated to the food, that if they're being digitally distracted, then they're not learning the core skills of eating. They're basically, their sensory overload, or their sensory attention is being directed elsewhere and not on the actual mindful art of eating. And I think the other thing too is the long-term consequences. Yes, we might get some short wins and we'll be, absolutely elated our kid is eating in front of a screen, but it's not necessarily long-term. And I think a bit like sleep association, we have to be really careful about our kids forming associations. So, if they go to somebody else's house where there isn't a screen, or they go to a restaurant where there's not a screen, will they have established those healthy eating habits?
Yeah, absolutely.
Really important.
So, say in life, there's, like with everything, there's a bit of a trade-off. We're having this, then we miss out on that. Can you tell us a little bit about what we would be trading off in life if we're spending too much time in front of the screen?
Yes, and I meant to dive into this at the start, but we got a little bit distracted. I've identified that kids have 7 basic needs, and these are unchanging developmental needs, and we've got a really strong corpus of research that substantiates that these are kids' basic needs, whether they were born in the 1970s or in 2010. Kids have these unchanging needs, and we have to make sure that their time with screens isn't replacing or superseding these basic needs. So kids have 7 needs. They include relationships and attachments. They need language. They need play. They need movement. They need good nutrition. They need sleep. And they need something called executive function skills, which are these higher order thinking skills. And what we're often seeing is that kids' use of screens is going in, if this was a 24-hour jar, this glass vessel, what we often see is that screen time goes in the jar first, and then we try and put these basic needs on top. And what we're seeing is that some of their basic needs are falling out. Kids aren't getting enough time to play and to be physically active and to use language. So what we need to do is make sure that, we put our kids' basic needs in the jar first, that they're getting those basic needs, and then screen time can fill up around that if there's some white space in the jar. So we need to also know that for our young kids, particularly before 3 years of age, that they have something called the video or the transfer deficit. And that is basically that kids learn less from a screen than what they do from touching real objects and from interacting with real people too. So there are some trade-offs for using screens, and it's not to say that screens are toxic and taboo. I'm a firm believer that if we match the right technology to the child at the right age, they can be hugely beneficial, but they can, when they're encroaching on these basic needs, or if they're not aligned with children's basic developmental stages, then they can encroach on their development.
Yeah. So when I look around at what is available digitally for children and how to enhance maybe that nutrition basic need, there's not a lot out there. Nutrition is probably one of the biggest basic needs that's actually not enhanced by using technology. Like, you can build and executive function skills with different sorts of apps and things like that these days. But nutrition's quite difficult. So I thought I would actually talk a little bit about some of the things you can do. So one thing you might notice that I do with my daughter is we have a cooking show. We run live on Facebook every Tuesday afternoon. The reason for that is she's off to school next year, and she's a very shy girl around different people and group situations. So we talked about how she could kind of perform a little bit. So she's quite happy and excited to do her online show for people when they're out there. And so for me, I was seeing that as a way for us to, one, enhance some of the other skills, but also to bring in some more familiarity with fruits and vegetables, talk about the cooking techniques. She likes to tell people about what she's been doing with the vegetables and fruits in other times. Sometimes she likes to tell people kohlrabi is a fruit and argue with me in front of everyone. But she is definitely a lot more engaged with the process. And so we're learning about cooking, but there's also the prepare for the live cooking. So we sit down on Pinterest and have a look at the different foods that we could cook, and we'll talk about what she'd like to do. And so for me, I am using screen time to enhance her nutrition. But one of the key things about that is it's actually joint media engagement. We're doing it together. She doesn't just go off on Pinterest by herself and menu plan at this stage. Hopefully one day.
Come on.
But what I find is when we are co-viewing this content or having some joint media engagement, these spontaneous conversations we're having about what we're seeing is actually helping us do so much more, because she'll say to me, oh, Mum, is that a fruit, or is this that? And I'll go, oh, no, actually, that's a vegetable because it grows, from the ground. And we talk a little bit about where that grows. And if we hadn't been looking at the screen necessarily, we might not have had that conversation. So there is a little bit there that can enhance.
Absolutely. And I love that you've pulled out the positive potential that technology, if it's used in the right ways, can support children's learning and development, and in this instance, their nutrition. There is a lot of research that substantiates that co-viewing, using technology with someone else, be it mum, dad, a sibling, a grandparent, can be really beneficial, particularly for those young children. As I mentioned before, that video deficit, kids don't often make meaning from what they see on a 2D screen and correlate that to the 3D world. So for our younger kids, particularly up until the age of 3, co-viewing is really essential where we can. I'm a mum and understand that's not always feasible, but when we can use it as a tool, and again, we're engaging, we're using language, we're building relationships, all of those basic needs that kids have, and we're doing it around food as well. So it's a really positive experience.
We're going to go on to boundaries next, because it's all nice to go. There's some positives, but we also have to have some sort of boundaries, and that's what you said about filling up that glass jar too much.
Absolutely. And kids really benefit from having firm parameters. I think as adults we often shirk from them, but our kids really respond positively to boundaries. And one of the reasons is that neurologically our kids' brains crave repetition. The neural pathways want repetition. So this is why your child wants the same book read to them every single night. Their brain neurologically is wired to crave that repetition. So if we can establish boundaries and be consistent with those boundaries, over time it becomes much easier to enforce. But really, really important that we establish these, and it builds healthy habits. Our kids, are going to establish a digital world, so cutting them off from technology or banning it isn't the solution, but teaching them how to have boundaries around not only when they use it, but also how they use it, and what they're using it for is important.
Okay, fantastic. Part of having boundaries, though, is sometimes they can get misconstrued as battle lines.
Yeah.
And what I think and what I like to talk to people about is more about this whole meal times are not an us versus them occasion. It shouldn't be like that at all. If it has become like that, it's potentially because the boundaries haven't been set up very clearly, or the boundaries are just like faded away over time. And this is, again, a lot of parenting comes down to just consistency.
Yes.
So if we are trying to not have those battles, one thing that I find is important, and we've definitely both got very similar mentality, is set and protect your boundaries. Like, set up what your boundaries are on screen times and set up what your boundaries are on meal times, and then protect them. Make sure we don't start crossing over those boundaries. Go, oh, well, just this once we'll do this, because then just this once turned into that happened every day this week. And you start to lose or muddy up those boundaries again. And then you find that battle lines are being drawn in the wrong spots, and we're starting to fight against our kids, or we're having these issues. And I'm like, that's not really what we want to do. So I thought I'd talk a little bit of guidance about how to set some mealtime boundaries, because first step is to acknowledge, we've got to have some boundaries. We all have to have a role and a responsibility during this event. And the best model out there is the Ellen Sutter division of responsibility. I find her research resonates very well with me and with pretty much everyone I talk to about it. And a lot of dietitians and feeding professionals will definitely agree with making sure when we have a family meal that we have roles and responsibilities. So in the division of responsibility for children over 2, their role, the child's role, is to decide whether they're going to eat it and how much they're going to eat. But then that's where their role ends. Our role is to provide what, when, and where. So this means we provide the food at the spot we want it, when we want it, and the content of the food, what they're actually going to be eating. This is so that children don't come back at us and say, well, I want this, or that's not their role. Their role is not for that, but our role is to decide on the what. If children are still learning about lots of different foods, we have to empower them to actually have some success at mealtimes. So they do need to have some foods that they can eat. But if they are used to just dictating what they want and not performing their role, we find battle lines come up, or we have issues. So I've done this in the worksheet. You'll find a nice little column of what the parent and their role is, and then what the child and their role is. But their main aim is the same. It's to enjoy the mealtime, or just, eat as a family. And so in terms of how we can do our roles as parents, we need to provide the food. We need to have the food ready at a place and a time that is expected by the children. If we're a bit flaky with when we get the meals ready and it's a bit all over the place, children will then have a bit of they don't have that security of knowing when the next meal is. And like we said, repetition routine is so important to kids. We're not saying you have to have it at 6 o'clock to the minute every night, but as long as they know, no, we're not eating a snack now because dinner's in half an hour's time, and they get used to that, they will know that next time I should have had more afternoon tea to get me through to dinner. And they will start to balance out their weather and their how much according to this routine. They're not going to be scared about getting enough food next time, or so it's a really important model to get your head around and try and sit down as a family and work out your own boundaries and your little guidelines as to what you're going to do. And you're probably very same.
Yes,
Screen time's exactly the same.
Exactly. I was just looking at it, and parents' responsibility is definitely to determine what, when, and where kids use screens. The only responsibility I might shift over to the parent is also the how much. I think in those formative years up until around 8, we really need to provide guidance with our kids, because if we're honest, they would be tethered to their devices 24/7. But apart from that, I think this model works perfectly in having those clear lines of demarcation between what your role is as a parent at mealtime and what the role of the child is at the mealtime too. So I think there's definitely some crossover there, which is important for our kids.
what I thought we'd do is talk a little bit about our media strategy. So it's all nice to give lots of facts here, giving you the background, but how are we actually going to execute this?
And stay sane.
And,
and as I mentioned before, I don't think, please don't misconstrue what we're saying in saying, you know, ban technology, never use it before meals or during meals altogether. But I think if we want to have some of these boundaries, we do need some strategies that will work, especially when it's that crazy witching hour and we're trying to juggle a million things. So one of the best things, and again, where possible, I'm wearing my mum hat here and saying, you know, we all know things don't always go to plan, but where we can, trying to switch off screens at least 10 to 20 minutes before mealtime, and have some sort of, again, predictable pre-meal routine. This should include some sort of proprioceptive input. So basically what we want to do is get our kids, this helps get their sensory system ready to actually eat. And as we mentioned before, so much of eating with our young children involves processing sensory information. So what we want to do is to get their proprioceptive system ready, primed basically, for eating a meal. So what we want to do, we want to get kids to empty out or to recalibrate more or less their sensory capabilities. So we want kids in our house, and this is one of the strategies that Simone's shared with me previously, is that we want we've tried it here, we get our kids to run up and down the stairs before it's mealtime, doing some wall push-ups. We've got a skipping rope out the back, and watching a 5 and a 2-year-old try and learn to skip is entertainment for ourselves. But getting them to jump on their bikes and do some laps on the back deck, jumping on the trampoline, anything that helps get their sensory system primed to eat can work in a really favourable way. What we know is that screen time can cause sensory overload. There is just so much bombarding our kids' nervous system and sensory system. So this is why sometimes it's much more difficult to actually get them to eat if they've gone from
a little bit not
TV to the table.
Not so much proprioceptive system. Like it's all visual and all that sort of sensory overload.
Absolutely. It's not visual and auditory.
Balanced.
And our young kids in particular need to get, and as I mentioned before, our kids aren't burning off energy, they're learning off it. So the brain is wired through movement. So basically they need a little energy burst to get them primed to actually dedicate their sensory resources to eating a meal. And I think we often underestimate, until we actually pause and think about it, or unless we're a researcher in this field, I don't think as parents we've ever really considered how demanding eating is in terms of sensory processing.
So it is the second hardest thing we ever learn to do.
Yes. And when you mentioned that to me, I was blown away because, as a researcher looking at the neuroscience, this has never come across my radar. But I think when we start to look at it like that, this is obviously it's a lifelong skill, but to see cognitively how demanding it is, I think is
because
surprising.
Even if, like I've said a couple of times, vegetables, they change from mouthful to mouthful. Even eating a wedge of pineapple, one end is always sweeter than the other. Little things like that, you're like, oh, it's not the same ever. So is it juicy on your hands? So you've got tactile stimulation, you've got auditory stimulation. Some food is quite noisy and everybody has
cheese in our house. It's all
different thresholds. So there's different. So say for me, for example, I have a lower auditory threshold than what my kids will have. I find it big noises a bit too much. I hate balloons popping, those sort of things. Whereas I can see my 2-year-old almost the opposite. She loves singing at the top of her lungs. And if I say to her, oh, is that a noisy food? She can't wait to investigate if that food's going to make big noises under her big teeth. And it's funny because, like, to me, those super, super crunchy chips, never my favorite. I like the fat, soft ones. So it's really funny just to see how my sensory preferences have always chosen my food preferences too. And I'm seeing how even having children in the same house, we have different taste preferences, but we have different sensory preferences. And different thresholds and other things that make our thresholds even lower. So when the girls are extra tired, trying to get a meal down and done is even harder because their thresholds are now down here. And if I'm going to battle them, it's not going to work. So I need to be on their team, talking to them about, let's get our systems back up and running. So we'll stop, go do some star jumps, come back.
And that physical activity, it just has a basic arousal effect. So, screen time can often make us feel, or our kids in particular, cause it's sensory bombardment, it can make them feel very fatigued. So to take them off the device and bring them to the table can be problematic too. And I think you touched on something that's really important again, and I know we've reiterated this, but we cannot engage in sensory processing if we're digitally distracted, because our kids have finite cognitive resources. So there's only so much attention that can be directed, and if they're digitally distracted, they're not calling on all their sensory input that they need to eat. So where possible, try to switch off screens 10 to 20 minutes before mealtime and get them physically active doing something.
The next tip we've got for you is to use the phrase "you can." I don't ask questions of my children anymore as much as I can. I do. You can do this. Lots of positive words around my direction. So if I want them to set the table with me, it's like, you can go get the bowl now. You can get your fork as well. And what I've done up for you today as well as a bonus with this webinar is a printable a you can jar. Lots of ideas that you can do in this 10 to 20 minute break before dinner to engage proprioceptive systems, or I've got some vestibular activities which are more those up, down, where's your movement happening, because that's my other daughter's favourite proprioceptive, activity before meals. If she is really struggling, we swing her upside down and she just totally resets, has a giggle, comes back and is ready to take on the task of eating. But that's her preference. It's not everyone's preference, and that's why I do things like the yoga cards with downward dog. That works for her. And my youngest, not so much. Not that way inclined.
And I'm thinking of my two boys that are chalk and cheese as well. So I think with the you can jars, which we're going to implement in our house because they're so fantastically designed, is perhaps having a jar for each of the boys, knowing what their sensory preference is, so that they can take out from their, the stick or the you can task that might appeal to them as well. So here, my next tip was to avoid trying to use screen time or food as a type of reward. So kids form strong associations with reward systems, and they become contingent upon them. And kids are very good. We all know they're great negotiators, where they catch us in our weakness. So trying to avoid using foods and screens as a reward to set up those unhealthy and unsustainable habits is something I think we really need to be mindful of. Our kids will very quickly learn to negotiate for 10 more minutes of the iPad or the TV if I get to eat this. So trying where we can to avoid those if statements, as you've mentioned too.
So the one thing that I do as a tool for that to help really get it out of my system, so instead of using those if and then tools even myself, so I know my kids can use them, but if I use it less and less, they will stop negotiating on with those words as well. And I notice that I'll do things like, no, first we're having dinner, then we're going to have bath, then we're going to, watch Peppa Pig. They know the 3 processes that are going to happen. I've chunked out the processes. It's not if you eat dinner and have your bath, you get to watch Peppa Pig. It's just those are the 3 things that are going to happen. And so I say, so now we're eating dinner as a family. Let's sit and eat as a family. And you can now pass me the vegetables or something, so I can then engage them in a more productive task than trying to negotiate something, because we've just chunked out the process. There's no questions about it. We're setting and we're sticking to those parameters. We're sticking to that. If we are going to say you will get dessert, you have to remember the roles and responsibilities. Your child is still allowed to choose whether or not they're going to eat it, but they still follow that process. So instead of saying if you eat this, you get dessert, it's no, we're eating our steak and veggies, then we're going to wash our hands, then we're going to have reading books, and then we're going to have dessert or something. You might have a 4-step process. You still have to come good on everything in that process.
Oh, they're very quick to point out when you don't follow the rules.
You didn't have our book time. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot the book.
Sneak that one away.
I tried to get you in bed a bit quicker.
Really true. And I'm just going to say, we do in our house, we call it Mexican and movie nights occasionally. So we do sit in front of a screen. It's certainly not every week, but every now and then we do enjoy it. And my children still I must admit, though, it's not as fantastic as when we don't. There's a lot of prompting. Again, they're digitally distracted. Their attention is elsewhere.
It takes like an hour to have
much
dinner.
longer.
Yeah.
So I've noticed a huge difference in that. But having said that, it's a little family ritual that we do enjoy together. So what I think we need to do is, if we elect to use screens, for those special occasions, just having boundaries around, this is what we do. It's Saturday, and we've decided to do it this week, but tomorrow night we're going back to the table, or back to our
and that's the same
routine.
as in terms of treat food, forbidden food. Sometimes people use lots of labels for it. I just call it food. Because it is. I don't want my girls thinking that it's only so much better than everything else, because it just puts it all out of whack. So it is okay to have treat food as well, but same thing. This is a boundary. Today we're having chocolate mousse. That's just a fact. There's no emotion tagged to it. And the same with and if you're going to try and always give screens as rewards, it builds up that.
It's that contingent behaviour.
Wonderful.
And our kids are expecting something in return, as opposed to intrinsically wanting to do something, building those healthy habits from the start.
Cool.
So if our kids if we were using screens, let's say we had a child who only ever ate dinner in front of a television or a tablet, going in cold turkey on a Monday afternoon and saying, right, we're sitting at the table, we're not using the device, could be catastrophic. We could have more tantrums than what we would had we used the device. So I think parents often need some guidance about, well, how do we make, if we have let screens creep into the mealtime, what are some practical strategies where we can try and change these habits over time that will work and won't result in tears and tantrums from us and our kids?
So definitely first thing you have to do is really be open and honest with them. We're going to talk about how we might change what's going on here and have a discussion. Okay, it's not easy to have a discussion like that with a 2-year-old, but a 2-year-old can be told, okay, today we have no TV for 10 minutes while we sit and have our food, and then you can have the TV or then you can have the iPad back. But we're going to do some exercise first. Then we're going to wash our hands. Then we're going to sit at the table, and then there'll be TV. And so they understand how to chunk it out, and that's from early on. And that's basic language, understandable. Okay, they haven't had a lot of buy-in and openness in the discussion, but they'll be quite like, okay, that's a process. And then if we stick to that process.
And that's where I think,
remind them.
We come undone.
We're washing our hands now. Now you can get the soap, and we take them through the process. And a lot of this does require a little bit more engagement from us, because we've got to push these routines. But we are the parents, and it is our responsibility for the what, when, and where. So we have to make that happen. Because otherwise, if they're negotiating the when and it gets pushed back half an hour, all that food, everything, it's all not working the way it was meant to.
That's right.
So,
and I think for our young children, they may not have the buy-in, they may not have the cognitive resources to be able to negotiate. But for our older children, I think if we are going to implement changes, involving them in the process is really critical too, and explaining why we don't want them always eating with or before a mealtime with a screen. I think if they can understand why we don't want them to do that, they might be more likely to engage in the process. And something
also, like, if they can't do the whole meal without the screen, that's okay as well. Maybe it is a matter of starting, 5 minutes, and then you'll get the iPad, or then, a couple of weeks later, or however long. And I never put time frames on people, because they learn at different stages. But some kids might like, 10 minutes, then I get the iPad, and then next week it might be, it's not iPad anymore, it's audiobook. Or it's something that's not as distracting from the learning process that they've got in front of them. It's a really hard learning process. So try to get them engaged with that as much as they can is important.
And I found something that works with older children in particular is, if you have had a lot of screen dinners, going in and doing the cold turkey changes obviously doesn't work, but those incremental changes work well. And even doing something, an activity swap. So instead of the TV that has the visual and the auditory distractions, perhaps just turning on some music, obviously being mindful of what sort of music you're choosing. But we can use that as a different way to engage our kids without it being, we've gone from some sort of stimulation to just nothing.
Yeah, and you don't want to be all at the table going, we don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And another one to not have at the table is the parent's phone.
Yes.
If we're going to say you can't have your iPad at the phone, it's very hypocritical if we then had our little Facebook scrolling happening. So definitely, and kids pick up on that as well. If you're eating at the dinner table and then you pick up your phone or it just bings, it does change that whole dynamic of that learning experience.
Yeah, I know I call it digital hypocrisy. We're often barking screen time limits at our kids from behind our smartphones. So we have to be mindful. Our kids are emulating our habits and they're seeing them. So we just need to be mindful about how we're using our device. We know actually from studies with psychologists that just the mere presence of a device on a table, on a dining table, even if it's placed face down, actually changes both the quality and quantity of language that's spoken at the meal table. So researchers, and this was done with adults, who you would think would have the capacity to say, I'm not going to be distracted by that face down object there, that its mere presence is digitally distracting us too. So our kids aren't immune either. So I think where we can, trying to minimise our use of screens at the meal table as well.
Yep, definitely.
What about when, and I know as a mum, that sometimes it's really tempting for us to hand over the screen while we get meals prepared. Do you have any thoughts or advice for parents that?
I think if that's how you're going to get it done. Some jobs in the kitchen are just too hard to get the kids involved in. If sharp knives are not your thing with your 2-year-old, I get it. But what you want to do is make sure food's all done. I take it as is to the middle of the table. Then it's engage with the kids. Get them ready and go to the table together. Your food, and another thing about their attention span, if you're getting their peak attention span ready for that meal and you've put down burning hot food in front of them and you spend the whole time going blow, 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 no, it's still too hot. You've lost the perfect window. You totally missed it. So I put the food out in the middle of the table, and when we all come up, they come to a plate that's not overwhelming because it's empty, and then they start control again. Serve themselves where they can. You might need to do some hand over hand on some tongs or something like that, but getting a little bit of control so that they can work out their whether and their how much is really important. And I do go into that in lots of other things. But definitely a matter of making sure that you have a way to stop, engage with them, and then come to the table. Even if you can only have 20 seconds of it, it's better than bringing the screen to the table potentially, just to get out of that habit. So that we have that break where we've stopped, we've looked at our food, we've served ourselves, and we've engaged with it. And then,
And I think another thing I've observed, and from personal experience too, I'm not immune to this either, is that if I'm checking my smartphone while I'm cooking dinner, I'm often digitally distracted and not present with my kids. So where I can, I think we need to be just mindful of us, our habits, not only at the dinner table, but in the lead up to it. I know, we have our best meal times when I have not been stressed and frazzled, and I'm often stressed and frazzled when I'm trying to multitask, respond to the email, chop up the veggies, and deal with kids that are bickering. I think we just need to take out one of those distractions where we can. And, I'm not perfect at this by any shot, but where I can, I've noticed a huge difference in my kids' mealtime behaviour if I can not use my phone as much in that preparation stage.
I find on the days when I can go, no, it's 4 o'clock, I'm going to put my phone in my bedroom and it's nowhere near us until after they're in bed. Bedtime goes smoother, dinner goes smoother, prep goes smoother. And I also realise that some of the meals, and I've got some recipe suggestions on your bonus e-cookbook, you put them in the oven or you do something, you've actually got 10 minutes to wait. Why don't you go and play with the kids or do something? It actually gives me back more opportunities, and I'm actually protecting my time better by not just having the phone within easy reach.
Absolutely.
So, there's a lot to be said about our modelling, plus how much more our kids will get out of that positive engagement time.
And our kids do, you know, it has pays spades in terms of the engagement and the relationships we're building with our kids, but it's also about establishing what I call healthy media habits, because our kids will inherit this digital world, so we want to foster and develop healthy media habits. And a critical part of that is actually teaching our kids to switch off. We need to model being able to switch off and untether from our digital devices, not walking around with our digital appendages all the time. And our kids do, you know, we see toddlers and infants who learn how to tap and swipe. We know neurologically their brain has something called mirror neurons, which is exactly why our kids mirror everything, you know, all our partners. It's always our partner's worst habits. But their brain actually has little motor nerves that explain why our kids copy everything that we do. So it's really important that then they're watching us. If we're, you know, trying to prep veggies and send SMS at the same time, that they're observing these behaviours. So we want to develop those healthy habits from the start where we can.
Perfect. Well, that's about all we've got for today. Excellent. So it's fantastic. So please feel free to enjoy all of your bonus content you've got there. You've got the family media kit. You've got the and there's a little video there I just showed how my kids painted them, and the e-cookbook, and I wanted to call it Get Out of the Kitchen. 5 recipes to get out of the kitchen. My husband said that was a bit harsh, so it's called Witching Hour Friendly Recipes or something.
Sounds just as good.
Yeah, but basically recipes that make you think, oh, I actually do have 20 minutes now before the dinner's ready, because it's just popped in the oven, it's a tray bake, things like that, and they will help you in your mind be able to work out ways to get some engagement with the kids, get some proprioceptive system inputs before dinner, so that they can engage with the food that they're. This is all seems very dinner centric, but it applies to breakfast too. If they're plonked down in front of and we've got background noise on, it's distracting for them. So if they, you know, what they call it, sunrise or whatever, the morning programs, there's morning programs on the TV. If they're on, they're distracting. We're not going to eat as quickly. We might start getting frustrated that they're not eating quickly. We've left them at the table alone so that they keep eating. Lots of bad habits form at all the meals. I know we've basically been quite dinner-centric with this, but it also happens to be when we like to present our kids with the hardest food groups, meat and vegetables.
We need to flip it, don't we?
Yeah, have your meat and vegetables for breakfast, and they're going to be a little bit more responsive. So, trying to think from the sensory point of view about the food that you're serving, about their actual ability to absorb these new learning experiences in front of them, and how much you can engage with them beforehand.
It is a precious time when it all goes
smoothly,
and hopefully you've got some practical strategies where you don't need to rely on the technology to fill the gap. So
okay, well, thanks for being here, and talk to you later. Bye.
Thank you.